Why is banking as a service so hot right now?
Yeah, that's completely true. Every company is striving to become a fintech company.
I think the demand for instant gratification is because we live in a digital world today.
Hello and welcome to episode number 8 of 11FS Spotlight. In this weekly show, we shine a spotlight on the best and brightest in tech and financial services to try and understand what gets them going, what gets the industry growing, and what do they think the future of the industry is going to be. Do not forget, follow us on LinkedIn so you never miss an episode. And just as a reminder, in case you missed the intro there, we have just released episode 2 of our brand new documentary series about banking as a service. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss it. Go to bit.ly/decoding Baz. That's bit.ly decoding BAAS to find out more. And a series link. You know, if you love banking as a service, why not? If you're a fintech nerd, get involved. On today's Spotlight, I am delighted to be joined by the one and only Peter Ramsey, who's founder of Built for Mars. We're going to be talking about UX and why it's so important for the financial services industry. Peter, how is it going, sir?
It's good. Cheers for having me on.
No, thanks for being involved. You were sort of saying that there's a certain console launch that you might never get to in the near future, and video games been quite all as busy in the world of fintech and UX, I guess.
It has been busy, and I'm embarrassed to say that I've that console launch has been on my mind.
Right. Well, it's fine. I think you're not the only one. But we do want to get the audience participation, whether you have comments about console launches or not. Do leave your questions in the sidebar and the comment bar, and we'll get Peter answering them for you today. To my mind, this is some of the best UX content I've seen out there. I love the reports on what you guys are doing at Built for Mars. But let's dive into you. Tell me a little bit about your background and what it is you do and how you got to where you are.
Sure. Yeah. So at the moment, I run Built for Mars, which is, I guess, a crossover between a UX blog, research, platform, and also a consultancy, I guess. Right. So I work with companies privately on their UX. I also write stuff that people can read online for free. And I guess encompassing what it takes to build good products, right? What it takes to, take something beyond that okay level that I think most companies do reach. And in terms of like what I did before that, so I started a fintech company in 2013, and then it was acquired in 2018. And through that 6-year onslaught of being a founder, right, it was the cliche romantic drop out of uni, start a company, that kind of experience. But I learned a lot about product just by doing, and it's something that I really enjoy. So all those hours kind of tinkering away in the garage of UX, right? When I kind of found some more free time, I just helped friends with their products, and then friends of friends, and ended up working with some pretty cool companies just doing theirs, right? So it's pretty organic.
It's weird how these things just sort of fall into place and following your nose. But I guess that journey into fintech, what motivated you to pick fintech in the first place, and the work you do? Was there a pull to it? Was it timing? What was it that stood out?
Yeah, a total accident. Yeah, absolute accident. I'm interested in it now. At the time, I wasn't. So the company I started was initially a property tech company. Oh. It was trying to be like TripAdvisor for property. What happened was we pivoted along the way to be what's now called open banking. But it was before it had a name, right? And we were using that to run a bunch of industry-specific tasks. So we pivoted into fintech reluctantly, and then I realized I really enjoyed it. And it's been
weird how fintech does that. It just kind of grabs you, and then you're like, oh, wait a second, this is kind of interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, I love it. Fintech's so deep when, I think if you just stopped someone in the street and said, how many like financial companies can you name? It'd be just banks. But there's actually so much to fintech that just makes other stuff run. So
it's one of those things where you scratch beneath the surface and it gets more and more curious. And I remember I was talking to a partner at a big VC firm a little while ago, one of the big West Coast VC firms, who was in fintech. And they were sort of observing that it's really weird that fintech's got really big in the last 5 or 6 years, because the people who were doing it 5 to 10 years ago were like, wait, everybody's now suddenly into my weird hobby. What the heck happened to the world?
Yeah.
It's like the whole world got into Dungeons and Dragons, or that obscure Japanese role-playing game that you liked. And it's like, why is everybody into this now? It's kind of an odd thing. But I guess a big part of it has been a real focus on UX, possibly driven by some of the challenger banks coming out and doing pretty good UX. It's changed the bar for the industry. But why is UX so important in financial services?
I was literally just thinking as you're talking that the motivator, I think, for the industry change were these challenger banks. Everyone else won't realize that we hadn't collaborated on that beforehand, but I was genuinely thinking that, right? I think what's happened is, in my mind, I think of Monzo because that was my first influence, but challenger banks in general, they kind of bridge the gap between financial tech and products that people enjoy using. And so when they came, people were like, oh, a bank can also be cool and easy to use. And before that, it was just kind of like assumed that your bank had really bad technology, at least consumer facing technology, right? So the UX bridges that gap between fintech that's inaccessible and stuff that people use regularly. We were chatting before this went out about crypto and the UX problem that crypto have, in that if it was easier to, without Coinbase, right, where do people buy crypto that's safe and feels nice? So they've got a similar problem there that I think will eventually be solved.
You see Revolut and Robinhood and Square and others sort of making that easier, but it's not the full experience. And it's interesting that a lot of the big banks reacted by doing better UX, but it's that difference between good and great, between it works and it just works. And the difference between those two seems like nothing, but actually is kind of everything. Do you think incumbents have started to prioritize this? And what really separates the incumbents from the challengers at this point?
Yeah. So I did a study on the banks specifically over the summer. And since then I have worked with a lot of those banks. The incumbent banks realize the troubles they have, and they are working on them. I think there are a number of reasons why those banks in particular are far behind, but I don't even think they at this point are not prioritizing UX. I think it's just more difficult for them. I think most companies have woken up to the importance of it. It's not that
they've not prioritized it, it's just executing it is harder. There's something about how the sausage gets made in there, isn't there? That like you can come up with a great design at the beginning for this sort of finest sausage you've ever seen in your life, but somewhere the machinery, what's coming out of the other side, isn't quite right, versus the production pipeline that a challenger has maybe looks a little bit different. So maybe it's less what you do and more the way you do it.
Yeah, these incumbent banks have legacy debt like beyond belief, right? They are walking through treacle with problems. So the ones I've spoken to, at least, they all try and fix this problem. It's just a mountain.
It's kind of crazy, isn't it? It's something as simple as a real-time notification is such a big impact on a user, because that sort of immediate confidence of, oh, that payment worked or it didn't, but here's what's happened, is very, very hard for big banks to pull off in their technology real estate. Even though they could make an app do it tomorrow, can the underlying tech do it? It's kind of a different thing. So do you think we're going to see that shift? Because the banks used to compete primarily on price. Do you think we're seeing that shift to utility and like competing on service more and more? And is that trend you're seeing one really continue?
I think banks don't have a choice to compete on price, right? Like, you know, these challenger banks are kind of proving you know, and it's not their fault, right? Like Monzo, when Monzo Premium came out, I did a post about that was, you know, here are a bunch of reasons that I don't think this is very good. But it's not Monzo's fault, because what do they have, right? Like, they're giving away a free service that at its core, 99% of the value is free. And then they're trying to charge for that additional 1%. So I don't think banks will be able to compete on prices. You know, who do you want to have your money, and who do you want to interact with on a daily basis? You know, the banks that I use in my personal life, like, I've chosen them based on the ones that if I have to call up with a problem, who do I want to have to call up? Yeah. And I think that, sorry, go on.
I was going to say that service element is not just the user experience on the front end app. It's the whole wrapper that comes with it.
Yeah, what integrations they have, what's their customer services like, you know. I mean, I spent a long time playing with the banks, so like at the point I had to make the decision which ones to keep, it was pretty easy for me.
Well, I mean, you've done your research, definitely.
I've done my, you know, if anyone's done more research than me before they choose a bank account, God help them, right?
Yeah, God, yeah. Bless some of the false team. There's questions coming in from the audience, so do keep them coming in if you're watching. First question from Ray Rafiq asks, will the incumbents just buy challengers, or is there too much culture clash there, do you think?
I think I was having this conversation with someone earlier, weirdly. I think if one of the challenger banks doesn't, you know, prove a revenue stream that works soon, they'll be forced to sell to somebody. You know, I think it's fairly likely we see an incumbent struggle enough on their own that they, you know, purchase a challenger bank purely for a fresh start with some of their users, right? Being able to kind of channel people into this cleaner tech is my opinion.
So many of the banks are struggling with their back end, as you said earlier. Actually, here is somebody with a back end that works, a front end that people like, but maybe a business model that doesn't have a balance sheet behind it that can push as much lending through it. Whereas there's somebody with a balance sheet that can push lending but has a real tech problem. It could actually be a win-win for both sides if done correctly. The emphasis on if done correctly, I suppose. But
yeah,
we've seen lots of that go wrong. We saw
no comment.
BBVA acquired Simple, for instance, and it didn't necessarily grow particularly after that. And I think they acquired Holvi in the Nordics, and where these acquisitions have happened and it sort of comes into the mothership, it seems to grind to a halt and really, really slow down. So, you know, like stepping back from that and kind of looking then at the most basic questions about user experience, what makes a really good user experience, and bring a financial services lens into that, but like, let's start at the principles. What do you look for in a user experience?
So at its core, user experience is stuff that is just obvious to someone, right? If like 99% of the stuff that I do, you know, publicly and privately, right, with other companies, is like embarrassingly pointing out obvious stuff. Like, you wouldn't believe the number of times that, like, I'll present my findings and it will be like, hey, this is going to really bore you, and I know you're not interested in font sizes, but this is a problem, right? so it's just obvious things, and I think good UX is just a product that is not annoying to use, that if you spent enough time looking at something, like, you don't find really awkward things with it.
Yeah, you don't find like confusion or like why is this pin here and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's just, you don't notice great UX because it's just something that works pretty well. And Apple have done it really well. They're probably one of my favorite examples of, if you turn an Apple product on, most people don't talk about any problems with that. Some do. From a fintech lens, like the challenger banks, right? When they came about, it was very rare you heard someone say, "Oh God, isn't Monzo awkward?" or "Isn't Starling weird to use?" Now, I think that is shifting with some of these because they're adding so much stuff to it.
The cleanness is almost being lost a little bit. It's
every time I boot up the Revolut app, it's got a new feature, right? And I'm having to relearn how to use it.
And I think there's something interesting about that, like path to profitability, blitz scaling approach of like how do you maintain user experience and still drive a business growth in a screen this size? It's a really interesting challenge. Have you seen anybody do that well?
Not quickly or cheaply.
Yeah.
UX scales at a magnitude, like people hugely underestimate the magnitude at which UX gets complicated. Doubling the number of features may 10x the complexity of your experience. And so, I think of Revolut as the example, right? They had a really clean interface at one point. They added some stuff, and now it's hugely more difficult. Maybe 20 times more difficult than it was 2 years ago.
Wow.
In my opinion, the complexity of keeping up with the growth of features and functionality is almost impossible without slowing stuff down to a point that I think startups aren't comfortable with.
Interesting.
And so, what normally happens is the companies that I kind of work with routinely, they'll have apps they release in new countries or new things they add to it. The speed at which they can bring an MVP up or an alpha up is pretty quick. They're good at that. The speed at which they can refine that is slow. But the great companies take that time to go back or to hold the release, essentially.
I think that, to me, is a really interesting point that I want to highlight. The great companies take their time and go back or hold on to the release. Definitely in VC land or in big bank land, there is definitely like release date pornography. It's like, when's it out? We shipped faster. It happened sooner, rather than net user retention, net user engagement, and qualitative metrics, but that you can quant as well, that really sort of drive effectiveness. People choose it happened sooner over it happened well. And that's kind of interesting that some other companies will just hold on to it. And I always think of Superhuman. I have a massive crush on the way they develop products, and thinking about sort of how much they tweak and obsess over user experience and tiny details, but that really create engagement, and how much you can strip away. One of my favorite sayings that Apple used once, I think, was a picture of the Ford Model T from 1907 and 1930, something like that. And there was like a little cone-shaped device by the driver's side window, and the cone-shaped device, they ask the audience, "What's the cone for?" And in the 1931 it had gone, but in 1929 it was still there, and in 1907 it was there. Any idea what the cone-shaped device was for by the driver's side window? This was to hold a whip, so that when your car inevitably broke down and horses came to collect you, you could whip the horses. So it was a whip holder.
Okay.
And it wasn't removed until the 1920s or 30s. And sometimes great design is about what you take away rather than what you put in. And that those powerful stories can make a meaningful difference. But enough crazy anecdotes. There's a good question from Owen Bennett, who said, "Who do you think will win the race? Old school banks that finally managed to create great UX, or challenger banks will eventually win the trust of the vast majority of the public? Crystal ball time.
So I think now I'm not being paid by any banks, firstly, right? Like, just to make that absolutely clear. I think that there are some incumbent banks that are very close, right? Like Barclays were awesome. Those guys are doing really well. If Barclays relaunched today with a new name, they would be as good as Starling.
Yeah.
Lloyds, I think, are another one that are really close. They have the same problem, which is almost like perception, right? When you think of Lloyds, you don't think of a great app.
Yeah.
And so when you're using the app, you don't think like, oh, this app's great. You think, okay, well, it's Lloyds.
Something about logo and perception and brand that's almost holding them back now, which is an interesting point.
Yeah. And on the other side, you got, I don't think Starling ever had a trust problem, or at least, Starling, Revolut, and Monzo encompass them right in the same bucket. I don't think consumers don't trust them. I think the problem is, would you want to have all your life savings in one of these challenger banks while they're called challenger banks? Right? Like, even the name suggests, they've got the other side of the brand problem, which is, you don't think that Barclays is a great innovative company because it doesn't sound like one. And you don't think that Starling, or Monzo, like the name just, the way we talk about them is kind of they're new. So I think time will solve this problem. In 5 years' time, you'll just look at these apps and they'll be very similar. And you'll just think, oh, Starling's been around 10 years now or whatever, right? They're probably safe.
It's kind of interesting to me that the people don't often credit the big banks that they've basically caught up on UX. It may have cost them a lot more. It may have been a lot harder, but they're more or less there. But the underlying cost challenges and the underlying tech challenges that kind of that made it so hard and expensive to get to where they are probably still there. So I wonder if they can attack that. There's a question here from Mike Fuller. He said, to what extent do you think adherence to brand standards inhibit or help UX design? There's a smile.
I understand the question.
So brand guidelines, essentially, style guides, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Can they be too restrictive? Can they hold back great UX?
Brand guidelines can ruin UX, right? Especially if they're overcomplicated.
Interesting.
So if the designs are too fancy, if you're using, too many JS animations, right? Like, there are a bunch of things that you can do to a style sheet that you could show me the style sheet and not the website, and I'll go, this will work like arse, right? Because I already know that this is going to be awkward. But I think the reverse isn't true, which is you could have brand guidelines that are, black and white fonts, like black fonts, white background. Like, you could have such a basic style sheet and still have amazing UX.
Yeah.
So I don't think your style sheet will be holding you back, other than it's not uniform enough and it's too complicated.
It's interesting. I've certainly been inside of banks historically, where both as a supplier to banks and as somebody who worked inside a bank, and designers have come up with something that looks and feels very much on brand, but the brand team have been one of those points of governance and gone, no, that's not included. So I wonder if that's what Mike's pointing at there. I don't know if you've seen anything along those lines, but as you think about the logos and look and feel, maybe there's something there. We've only got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to move to the question I had here around the pandemic change. Have you seen things really change in the pandemic from a UX perspective, or has it been kind of more of the same?
It's hard to say, really. So my work has certainly increased, right? I'm busier than ever, but I don't know if that's just the trajectory of Built for Mars or industry-wide. I do think that, like, I'm super bullish that UX will be much more important in 5 years. And I think that especially now that companies have had to change and perhaps put on hold like future investments in product, right? They're kind of going back to look at, instead of redesigning everything, instead of building all that functionality, can we make the users we have now stick around a little longer? Like, we don't want to do a Super Bowl advert again, right? Like, can we just make those people use our product 5% more? And the answer is yes, they can, probably, right? So I think from my experience, it's got more important and busier.
It's
I wouldn't be able to
interesting
say for sure.
You're talking about the return on investment of UX there and real world business impact that I don't think you hear an awful lot of. And the amount historically that the bank's model was marketing and pricing. And that was, here's the big advert, here's the teaser rate that gets you in. And then hopefully we'll retain you within that experience, but there's no other good experiences. Actually, can you create more engagement, more cross-selling, more use of product, more share of wallet, just with a great experience, and the business impact of that's really, really key. You're currently working on a series of publications all about the user experience in payments. What have you learned so far, and can you set the scene on the many chapters you've got in this publication?
Yeah. So I've just finished it. So it was a four chapter publication. I would summarize it as, I went into it thinking Square would be the best, right? And I went in thinking that I think Square have the most prominent brand in the space in terms of, challenger, even though they've been around, I think, since 2009, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
So it's not a new company, but what I found was, I've actually got it next to me, right? This is the Verifone one.
Yeah.
Proper old school. You can print stuff out on it. That is way worse than the new ones, and not at a hardware level. The hardware is actually pretty decent. I think for the price of the hardware, you're getting more for your money. The real crux of it is that these software companies, iZettle, so PayPal, SumUp, Square, and Shopify, who I talk about a little bit, they're so far ahead on the software layer that I really don't think that Verifone will ever catch up.
Which is crazy, because I think those businesses are still trying to undercut them. I don't know if you saw JP Morgan launch something in the US called Quick Access. And it's like, oh, well, it's like Square, except we've done away with some of the fees, so it's cheaper. And what you're saying is something different, in that actually, no, the experience is a differentiator here.
Yeah, I think I ended the whole publication by saying, I think, and Square, iZettle, SumUp, they could charge twice as much as they do now, and I'd still recommend them, right, over the incumbents. And Verifone aren't the only one. There's one called Ingenico and or something, Ingenico. They both, I think between them, they hold like 80% market share. They are by far the duopoly of the industry. And these new, they're not new, they're 10 years old, but these companies, the software they have is just so much better.
And it's interesting because the business model's changed as well. So with Ingenico, they're sold through partners. So the acquiring banks, the Barclays, the HSBCs, the WorldPays will distribute Verifone and Ingenico equipment, versus Square and PayPal, who are kind of much more vertically integrated. I'm conscious of the time, and everybody's got days to get to. So I'm going to ask you two quick questions. Number one, what piece of advice do you give to designers or founders looking to build more effective UX?
Put it down and come back to it a week later, and just try and think of common sense, right? If your gut tells you, if you look at something and your gut goes like, oh, that's a bit weird, is it? Like, it probably is. but definitely like leaving and coming back to something helps. And, you know, just try and be aware of what's awkward, right? Like when we use products, we're all aware of what's awkward or fiddly. Like if you have to double tap something because the first time it didn't work, you should stop yourself and go, hold on a minute, that was terrible, right? Like I just had to do something. So yeah, aim for full autonomy.
I think a style guide coming soon. And last but not least, where can people find out more about you and what you do?
Yeah, so the website, builtformars.com. That's where I publish a bunch of free stuff. You don't have to sign up. There's no ads. So you can just read stuff there. It's got a newsletter, or you can find me on Twitter, which is @builtformars. I'm sure you'll put links somewhere, right? It'll be like,
oh yeah, absolutely, in all the distros. Do check it out. But so Built for Mars, find it on your favorite channel now, and builtformars.com. That is all we have time for this week. But don't miss our other live show, Newsroom, which goes live on Tuesdays at 3:30 GMT or 10:30 on the East Coast. In Newsroom, we take a deep dive into the biggest story every single week. Make sure you also give us a follow on LinkedIn so you never miss an episode. And don't forget, check out Decoded Banking as a Service. Head to the 11FS YouTube or click on the comments. Have a great week, everybody.